Did you ask the owner of the house for permission? The question left my mouth with a calmness I hadn't expected, even from myself. I had just opened the door to my apartment, grocery bags still dangling from my arms, and there she was. Chloe, my daughter-in-law. Standing in the middle of my living room as if nothing were wrong, with two enormous suitcases at her feet, and an expression on her face that mixed surprise with something worse, annoyance. As if I were the intruder. As if my arrival had ruined her perfectly laid plans. She looked up at me, blinked twice, and then let out that awkward little laugh she used whenever someone confronted her. A short, sharp laugh, designed to make the other person feel they were being ridiculous. But I didn't look away. I stood there, in the doorway of my own home, holding the heavy bags full of produce and cans, waiting for an answer she clearly hadn't prepared. "Hi, Audrey. I didn't hear you come in." Her voice sounded light, almost musical, as if we were having a casual chat about the weather, as if the suitcases didn't exist, as if it were completely normal for her to be in my apartment on a Thursday afternoon, without having called, without having asked, without having shown the slightest consideration for the fact that this was my space, my sanctuary, the only place in the world where I could still breathe without anyone demanding anything from me. I didn't move. I remained standing at the entrance, feeling the weight of the bags begin to leave red lines on my forearms. But I didn't let go. Something inside me had hardened the exact moment I saw those suitcases. Something that had been soft for years, pliable, always ready to yield, had just found a boundary. "I asked you a question, Chloe." My voice was firmer this time. She tucked a strand of her perfectly styled hair behind her ear, that gesture she made when she needed to buy time to think of what to say. Her eyes, lined with light shadow that matched her designer blouse, avoided mine for a second, before looking back at me with that small, condescending smile I so detested. "Audrey, please don't overreact. David and I just need to stay for a few days. They're doing renovations on our condo and the noise is unbearable. The contractors get there at 6 o'clock in the morning and don't leave until 7 o'clock at night. We can't sleep. We can't work. We can't live like this. We thought it wouldn't be a problem to come here. After all, you live alone, and you have 2 rooms you don't even use." There it was, that sentence that summarized exactly what my family thought of me. You live alone, and you have space you don't use. As if my life were an empty space, waiting to be filled by the needs of others. As if the fact that no one was sleeping in the rooms next door automatically turned my home into a resource available to anyone who needed it. As if my 68 years of existence didn't give me the right to decide how, when, and with whom to share my space. I finally walked into the apartment and dropped the bags onto the dining room table. The sound of the cans hitting the wood resonated louder than I expected. Chloe took a step back, barely perceptible, but I noticed it. Her body language had changed. She wasn't so relaxed anymore. The discomfort was beginning to filter through that mask of certainty she always wore. I stood by the table, without putting away the groceries, without moving toward the kitchen as I normally would have. My hands rested on the wooden surface, and I could feel my own pulse beating in my fingertips. It wasn't fear. It wasn't nervousness. It was something different. It was the feeling of reaching a point of no return. "Does David know you're here?" The question was rhetorical. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. I needed to confirm what I already suspected, that my son had allowed this, that he had been part of this plan from the beginning, that they had both decided together that my consent wasn't necessary. Chloe let out a long, theatrical sigh, as if I were being unreasonably difficult. "Of course he knows, Audrey. It was his idea, in fact. He's finishing up some things at the office and is coming later with the rest of our stuff. I thought he would have called you to let you know. He didn't call you? No, he didn't call me. And that silence, that absence of a simple phone call, said everything I needed to know. My son, David, the boy I had raised alone after his father disappeared from our lives when he was just 7 years old, the same one I fed with the salary from my double shifts, cleaning offices and serving coffee, the same one who hugged me when he was little and told me that when he grew up, he would take care of me forever. That same son now found it perfectly acceptable to move into my home without consulting me, as if I were an extension of his convenience, a resource at his disposal. I walked toward the suitcases. I stood in front of them, looking at them as if they were strange objects fallen from another planet. They were expensive, one of those brands Chloe boasted about on her social media. Shiny, new, probably bought on one of those trips they took every 2 months, while I was still using the same worn-out suitcase I had bought 15 years ago at a clearance sale. And you thought this was okay? Showing up at my house with your suitcases without asking me if I agreed? Without even considering for a moment that maybe I had plans, that maybe I value my privacy, that maybe I don't want people living here. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest. Her posture shifted. She was no longer the casual, relaxed daughter-in-law. Now there was defensiveness in every line of her body. Audrey, you're David's mother. We're family. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. It's just for a few days, maybe a week. It's not like we're asking you for something impossible. Besides, I thought you'd be happy to have company. You always say this house feels empty. Empty. That word echoed in my head like a funeral bell. Yes, I had mentioned once that the house felt quiet after my sister Olivia moved in with her daughter last year, but there was a huge difference between quiet and empty. My house was quiet because I chose it to be that way, because after decades of noise, of demands, of being available for everyone but myself, I had finally found peace in the stillness. But Chloe had taken that casual confession and turned it into justification, as if my moment of vulnerability gave her permission to invade my space, as if admitting I sometimes felt lonely was the same as begging for someone to come fill every corner of my life without asking me first. Listen to me carefully. My voice was low but firm. Chloe stopped moving. Something in my tone made her truly pay attention for the first time since she had arrived. This house can feel however it wants to feel to me. It can be quiet, or it can be full of noise. It can be empty, or it can be complete. But what it will never, ever be is available for anyone to use without my permission. I am the owner of this house, Chloe, not a convenient option for when you have a problem. She opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment we heard the sound of a key in the lock. The door opened and David walked in. My son, carrying 2 more bags and wearing that carefree smile he used when he thought everything was under control. Mum, good thing you're already here. Chloe explained it to you, right? We're just going to be here for a week, 2 maximum. You'll see, you won't even notice we're here. Won't even notice they're here. David's words floated in the air as if they were the most reasonable thing in the world. He dropped the bags on the floor next to the suitcases, dusted his hands on his pants, and looked at me with that expression I knew too well. It was the same face he made when he was 12 years old and came home late after playing basketball with his friends, expecting me not to be mad because, after all, he was just being a normal boy. Except David wasn't 12 years old anymore. He was 42, and I was no longer that young, exhausted mother who gave in to every smile because I was too tired to fight another battle. I stood by the dining room table, my hands still resting on the wood, watching him enter my apartment as if it were his own territory. as if the last 40 years hadn't passed, as if continuing to be his mother automatically meant I had relinquished any expectation of respect or consideration. David walked closer and tried to give me a kiss on the cheek. I didn't move. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean toward him either. I stayed exactly where I was, and he must have noticed something in my posture because he stopped halfway, a look of confusion briefly crossing his face before turning into a wider, more forced smile. "What's wrong, Mum? Did you have a bad day?" A bad day. As if my reaction was the product of a passing mood, as if the problem was that I had waited in line too long at the bank or that traffic had been heavy. Not that my son and daughter-in-law had decided to move into my house without consulting me. Not that they had treated me as if my opinion were irrelevant. Not that they had assumed that my life, my space, my peace, were resources available for their convenience. I didn't have a bad day, David. I had an unpleasant surprise arriving home and finding your wife settling in here without anyone asking me if I was okay with it. David let out a laugh, a genuine laugh, as if he had just heard something funny. He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture he made when he thought someone was overreacting, and shook his head. "Mum, please don't be dramatic. I called you twice this morning and you didn't answer. I thought you were out and that we could get settled while you were gone. It's not a big deal." I looked over at Chloe, who was now standing next to the suitcases with her arms still crossed, watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and something that looked dangerously like satisfaction. As if my confrontation with David was proving something she already suspected. That I was difficult, that I was unreasonable, that I was the obstacle in a situation that should be simple. "You called twice, and when I didn't answer, you decided that was enough authorization to move into my house." "We're not moving in, Mum. We're just staying for a few days." David moved towards the kitchen, opened the refrigerator casually, took out a bottle of water I had bought that very afternoon, and drank directly from it. That small gesture, so insignificant to any outside observer, felt like a confirmation of everything I had been thinking. He didn't see a difference between his space and mine. To him, my house was an extension of his. My refrigerator, my food, my privacy. Everything was part of a shared territory where he had unlimited access. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to control the pressure I felt building in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper, older. It was the accumulated weight of decades of being the person who always yielded, who always understood, who always put the needs of others before her own. It was the exhaustion of having spent my entire adult life being useful, available, convenient for everyone except myself. "How many days is a few days, David?" He shrugged, still drinking the water without looking directly at me. "A week. 2 maximum. The contractors said they'd finish quickly. It's just until we can sleep in our own room again without waking up to the sound of drills at 6 o'clock in the morning." 2 weeks. 14 days of having 2 people in my space, using my bathroom, eating my food, disrupting my routine. 14 days of not being able to walk in my pajamas through my own living room if I woke up thirsty in the middle of the night. 14 days of having to consider others' schedules before deciding if I could watch my favorite show or listen to my music. 14 days of giving up the peace that had cost me so much to build after years of noise and chaos. And you assumed I would be okay with that. David finally capped the water bottle and looked at me with something that tried to look like patience, but was thinly disguised condescension. "Mum, you're my mother. Of course, I assumed you would be okay with it. What did you want us to do? Stay in a hotel and spend $150 per night when you have 2 empty rooms here? That doesn't make sense." $150 per night. There was the real truth, naked and unadorned. It wasn't about them needing me. It wasn't about them wanting to spend time with me. It was about money. about economic convenience, that using my apartment for free made more sense than paying for their own comfort. And I, as always, was expected to understand, to be reasonable, to put their financial needs above my emotional well-being. Chloe cleared her throat from her spot next to the suitcases. When she spoke, her voice had adopted that soft, conciliatory tone people use when they want to seem reasonable while manipulating a situation in their favor. Audrey, we really don't want to cause you any trouble. If it is a problem, we can help with expenses. I don't know, maybe $50 extra for utilities. We'll be using water and electricity. It's only fair that we contribute. $50. As if the problem were the cost of utilities. As if I could put a price on my privacy, my routine, the quiet mornings where I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and simply existed without having to be a mother-in-law, a hostess, or any other role that others needed me to play. It's not about money, Chloe. My voice came out more tired than I intended. David approached again, this time putting a hand on my shoulder, with that gesture he had used 1,000 times when he wanted to soften me up. Then what is it about, Mum? Just tell me what's bothering you and we'll fix it. You want us to buy the groceries? Perfect, no problem. You want us to clean everything before we leave? We can do that too. You want us to be quiet in the mornings? We'll be quiet as mice. Tell me what you need and we'll do it. And what I needed was for them to have asked me beforehand. What I needed was for them to have considered that maybe I had the right to say no. What I needed was for them to understand that being family didn't mean having automatic access to every aspect of my life without my consent. But how could I explain that without sounding like the selfish mother, the difficult mother-in-law, the unreasonable woman who refused to help her own family in a time of need? I gently moved David's hand from my shoulder, not abruptly but firmly enough for him to know the gesture wasn't welcome right now. What I need, David, is for you to understand that this is my house. Not a hotel, not a backup option, not a resource available every time you have an inconvenience. It's the place where I live, where I rest, where I have the right to decide who comes in and who stays. But we're your family, Mum. His response was immediate, almost automatic, as if those 4 words were an irrefutable argument, as if the simple fact of sharing blood nullified any expectation of respect or consideration. And maybe, for a long time, I had believed that. Maybe, for years, I had accepted that being family meant always being available, always understanding, always willing to sacrifice my own needs for theirs. But something had changed. Maybe it was turning 68 and realizing that time was no longer infinite. Maybe it was the death of my friend Shirley last year, who spent her last days regretting never having lived for herself. Maybe it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of decades of being invisible in my own life. Precisely because you are my family is why this hurts more, David. Because I would expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also have a right to my space, my peace, my decisions. David exchanged a look with Chloe. It was quick, barely a second, but I saw it. It was that look couples share when they think they're dealing with someone difficult, when they need to stand united against what they perceive as a common problem. And in that moment, I was the problem. David let out a long sigh, one of those he used when he felt a conversation was taking too long to get anywhere. He ran both hands over his face, a gesture of barely contained frustration, and then looked at me with that expression he had perfected over the years, the patient son dealing with a complicated mother. Look, Mum, I understand you're upset because we didn't give you more notice. You're right about that. But we're already here. The suitcases are inside. Chloe already unpacked some things in the guest room. What do you want us to do now? Go look for a hotel at 6 o'clock in the evening on a Thursday, when I have meetings starting at 7 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. There it was. The guilt, presented not as a direct emotion, but as a series of practical inconveniences that I would be causing if I insisted on holding my ground. As if the fact that they had already begun to settle in without my permission now obligated me to accept the situation. As if their lack of planning automatically became my problem to solve. I looked toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The guest room door was ajar, and from where I was, I could see a corner of the bed with what looked like clothes already spread out on it. Chloe had said she had unpacked some things. She wasn't asking permission to stay. She was establishing territory. I walked toward that room. I heard David's footsteps behind me, and then Chloe's voice saying something quietly to him that I couldn't distinguish. I pushed the door completely open, and what I saw confirmed what I already suspected. Not only were there clothes on the bed, there were toiletries lined up on the dresser. Chloe's makeup bag was open next to the mirror. There were 2 pairs of shoes neatly arranged against the wall. A laptop was plugged into the only available outlet near the nightstand. This wasn't the preparation of someone planning to stay for a few days. This was the settling in of someone planning to set up for weeks. I turned around to face David, who had stopped in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching me cautiously. "A week, you said?" He nodded, though his eyes avoided mine for a second before looking back at me. "2 maximum, Mum. I told you." "And all this settling in is for 2 weeks? The laptop, the bath products, the clothes enough for a month?" David shrugged. That casual gesture he used when he wanted to minimize something he knew was important. "Chloe needs to work from here, and obviously we brought what we needed to be comfortable. We weren't going to live out of a suitcase for 2 weeks." Comfortable. That word resonated in my head. They needed to be comfortable. In my house, in my space, using my resources. And I, apparently, just needed to be understanding. I left the room and returned to the living room, where Chloe was now sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window, the one I had bought 3 years ago after saving for months. She had her phone in her hand, scrolling through the screen with the casual concentration of someone with no immediate worries. When she saw me enter, she looked up and offered another one of those small smiles. "Audrey, we really are going to be as little trouble as possible. You won't even notice we're here. I work online, so I'll be in the room most of the day. David leaves early and comes back late. We can buy our own food if you want, or cook for the 3 of us." "Whatever you prefer?" "Whatever I prefer." As if all these options she was presenting were genuine. As if she were really giving me decision-making power, and not simply offering variations of a situation I had never agreed to in the first place. I walked closer to the armchair where she was sitting. I didn't say anything immediately. I just stood there, looking at her, waiting to see if she understood what I was communicating without words. She blinked. The smile began to slowly fade, and after a few seconds, she got up from the armchair with an awkward movement. "Sorry, did you want to sit here?" I didn't want to sit there. I wanted her to understand that every square inch of this apartment was mine, that this armchair wasn't an available seat for anyone who needed it, but the place where I spent my afternoons reading, where I sat with my coffee every morning, where I had cried after Shirley's funeral, where I had made the decision to finally quit that exhausting job at the coffee shop and accept my retirement. David entered the living room at that moment, and the tension must have been visible, because he stopped halfway, looking between Chloe and me as if he were trying to assess how serious the situation was. "Mum, can we talk for a moment? Just you and me?" I nodded. Maybe a private conversation with my son would achieve what this group confrontation wasn't. Maybe if I spoke to him directly, without Chloe acting as reinforcement for his position, he could truly hear what I was trying to say. We went to the kitchen. David leaned against the counter, crossed his arms, and looked at me with an expression that tried to be serious, but primarily conveyed impatience. Okay, Mom. Talk. What's really bothering you? Because I feel like there's something more than just the fact that we didn't call you beforehand. There was something more. Of course, there was something more. But how could I explain to my son that what bothered me was the accumulation of years of feeling invisible? How could I tell him that this incident with the suitcases was only the most recent manifestation of a pattern that had been repeating itself for decades? You bother me, David. It bothers me that you grew up thinking my life is a resource available when you need me, but not a priority when it comes to basic consideration. He frowned, genuinely confused, as if my words made no sense. I don't understand what you mean by that. When was the last time you visited me without needing something from me? The question came out before I could stop it. David opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again without producing any sound. He was searching his memory, trying to find an example that would disprove my accusation, and the fact that it was taking him so long to find one only confirmed my point. Me, Mum? I come to see you often. You come when you need me to look after your dog because you're going out of town. You come when Chloe is busy and you need me to hold on to some important documents. You come when you've fought with her and need a place to stay for a night. You come when there are problems with the car and you need me to lend you money for the repair shop. But when was the last time you came just to ask me how I was? To spend an afternoon with me? To be interested in my life beyond what I can do for you? That's not fair, Mum. His voice had risen in volume, and I could hear the defensive tone filtering through every word. I call you on the phone. I text you. I asked you last week if you wanted to go out to dinner with us. You invited me to dinner because it was Chloe's birthday and you needed someone else to help pay the check. You didn't invite me because you wanted my company. In fact, you barely spoke to me the entire dinner. The two of you spent the whole time discussing where you were going on vacation next month, while I sat there eating my salad in silence. I didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you say anything at the time? Because I never say anything, David. Because I learned a long time ago that when I say something, when I express that I feel ignored or unvalued, you make me feel like I'm overreacting, that I'm too sensitive, that I should be grateful that you included me. So I stopped saying things. I stopped expecting. I stopped believing that my presence in your lives was anything more than functional. He shook his head, running his hands through his hair in frustration. This is ridiculous. You're turning this into something much bigger than it is. We just need to stay here for a few days. We're not trying to invade your life or make you feel bad. We just need temporary help with a housing issue. And did it not occur to you that maybe I have a life too? That maybe I had plans for these 2 weeks? That maybe I enjoy my routine and my privacy, and I don't want to give them up because you decided to remodel your apartment without considering alternatives? What plans, Mum? What is it you do all day that is so important that you can't share your space with your own family? And there it was. The question that revealed exactly what he thought of my life. To David, I didn't do anything important. I didn't have significant commitments. I just existed in a state of constant availability, waiting for someone to need me to have purpose. I don't have to justify my days to you, David. The simple fact that I want to be alone in my own house should be reason enough. David let out a short, humorless laugh and shook his head as if dealing with something completely absurd. He straightened up, stopping his lean against the counter, and looked at me with an expression that mixed disbelief and barely contained frustration. So what you're saying is that you prefer to be alone than to help your own son? That your comfort is more important than your family's needs? I wasn't saying that. Or maybe I was. but not in the way he was interpreting it. It wasn't about choosing my comfort over their needs. It was about recognizing that my needs mattered too, that I also deserved to be considered, that my life wasn't a blank space waiting to be filled by the urgencies of others. What I'm saying is that you should have asked me before assuming I would be available, that you should have given me the option to say yes or no, that you should have treated me with the same respect you would treat any other person you were asking for a huge favor. It's not a huge favor, Mum. It's letting your son sleep in your guest room for a few days. It's giving up my privacy for 2 weeks. It's changing my entire routine. It's sharing my bathroom, my kitchen, my living room, every space where I breathe. It's giving up the peace that cost me so much to achieve after years of living for everyone but myself. David looked up at the ceiling, as if seeking divine patience, and then looked back at me with that tired expression he used when he felt someone was being unnecessarily complicated. You know what, Mum? I think the real problem here is that you've been alone too long. You've become selfish. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but it's the truth. You weren't like this before. Before, you always had your doors open for me, for anyone. Do you remember when you let my friend Henry live here for 3 months when his parents kicked him out of the house? Do you remember when your sister Olivia practically lived here for an entire year? You never said anything then. You never complained about your privacy or your routine. Of course, I remembered. I remembered Henry, who was 19 years old then and had nowhere to go after his father kicked him out for failing college. I remembered cleaning his dirty dishes every morning, doing his laundry because he never had time, cooking for 2 even though I barely had enough money for 1. I remembered Olivia, my older sister, who stayed with me after her divorce and turned my small apartment into her healing space, while I kept working double shifts to keep both our finances afloat. I remembered all of that. And I also remembered how I felt during those periods. Invisible, exhausted, resentful, but unable to express it, because the people I loved needed me. And I had learned from a very young age that women like me existed to be needed, not to need. You're right, David. I didn't say anything before. I used to swallow my discomfort and smile and pretend everything was fine while I faded away a little more each day. I used to believe that being a good mother, a good sister, a good person meant constantly sacrificing myself for others. But you know what? I got tired. I got tired of being the convenient solution to everyone's problems. I got tired of my generosity being taken for granted. I got tired of waiting for someone, sometime, to ask me what I needed. But we did ask you what you need, Mum. We just asked you a moment ago. We told you to tell us what you want us to do. You asked me what I wanted after you had already made the decision for me, after you were already settled in. After the situation was already in motion. That's not asking. That's asking for retroactive permission, hoping I'll feel so guilty for saying no that I'll end up giving in anyway. I left the kitchen. I couldn't stay in that closed space with David looking at me as if I were the problem, as if my resistance were a character flaw instead of a legitimate boundary. I returned to the living room where Chloe was now standing by the window, arms crossed, looking down at the street. She turned when she heard me enter, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw something different in her expression. It wasn't the confidence from before. There was caution there now, maybe even a little worry. David came out of the kitchen behind me, and the silence that filled the living room was so dense I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. None of the 3 of us spoke for a moment. We just stood there, forming an uncomfortable triangle of accumulated tension. Finally, it was Chloe who broke the silence. Her voice had lost that casual, confident tone. Now it sounded more careful, as if she were choosing every word with precision. Audrey, if you really don't want us to stay, We can find another solution. We don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own house. I looked at David, expecting him to back up what his wife had just said. But he was looking away, his jaw tense, clearly annoyed at how this whole situation was unfolding. And in that moment, I understood something I should have maybe understood years ago. My son wasn't going to defend me. He wasn't going to admit they had made a mistake. He wasn't going to validate my feelings or apologize for assuming my life was at their disposal. Because to him, I was still that mother who always said yes. That mother who moved mountains to make things easier for him. That mother whose love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. And any deviation from that pattern wasn't personal growth on my part, but a flaw that needed to be corrected. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Chloe had vacated a few minutes ago. My legs were tired. My whole body was tired. In reality, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion from having gone to the grocery store or standing during this endless conversation. It was a deeper fatigue, the kind that accumulates over decades of carrying the emotional weight of other people, with no one offering to help with your own. I want you to explain something to me, and I want an honest answer. David finally looked at me, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. What do you want us to explain? If the situation were reversed, if I showed up at your apartment with my suitcases without notice, saying I needed to stay for 2 weeks because there was a problem with my building, would you welcome me without a second thought? I saw the exchange of glances between David and Chloe. It was quick, barely a second, but it was enough. They both knew the answer, and they both knew the answer was different from what they expected from me. Chloe cleared her throat, searching for the right words. Well, we would have to think about it. Our apartment is smaller, and we both work from home now. It would be complicated with the space and… Exactly. It would be complicated. You would have to think about it. You would consider your needs, your space, your comfort, and you would be completely within your rights to do so. No one would judge you for protecting your privacy. No one would call you selfish for wanting to keep your routine intact. No one would expect you to sacrifice your peace of mind just because I'm family. But you're my mother, Mum. It's different. David had taken a step toward me, his hands outstretched as if trying to explain something obvious I wasn't grasping. Why is it different? Does being your mother automatically mean I have less right to my own life? Does it mean my needs matter less than yours? Does it mean I can be ignored, invaded, taken for granted, because my role is to serve you? I'm not saying that. But you are demonstrating it, David, with every decision you make without consulting me, with every assumption that I'll be available, with every time you minimize how I feel because it doesn't align with what you need me to be. I got up from the armchair and walked toward the suitcases that were still by the entrance. I looked at them as if seeing them for the first time. They were physical, concrete objects, but they represented something much larger. They represented years of unestablished boundaries. They represented decades of teaching my son that my space was his space, that my time was his time, that my life was a shared resource he could take from without asking. And I had been the one who taught him that. I had created this pattern. For years, I had prioritized being the perfect mother, the available mother, the mother who never said no, without realizing that in doing so, I was slowly erasing any expectation of reciprocity or respect. David approached and put his hand on my shoulder again, more gently this time. Mum, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We just want a place to sleep for a few days. We're not trying to take anything from you. But you were taking something from me. You were taking away the ability to decide about my own life. You were taking away the right to say no without being punished with guilt. You were taking away the possibility of existing as something more than an extension of your needs. I pulled my shoulder away from his hand, not aggressively but firmly enough for him to understand the gesture was not welcome. This is my house, David. I pay the rent. I pay the utilities. I decide who comes in. And right now, I'm deciding that I need you to leave. The silence that followed my words was so absolute that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. David stood completely motionless, his hand still suspended in the air where my shoulder had been, looking at me as if he hadn't fully understood what I had just said. Chloe let out a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a disbelief-filled laugh. "What did you say?" David's voice sounded strange, higher pitched than usual, as if the words had gotten stuck somewhere between his throat and his mouth. He ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and then looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. "Mum, please tell me you're joking." "I'm not joking. I need you to take your things and leave." Chloe stepped forward, with her hands raised in a gesture intended to be conciliatory, but which actually conveyed barely contained desperation. "Audrey, wait. We can talk about this. If we did something wrong, we can fix it. You don't have to kick us out. We're family." Family. That word again, used as a shield, as justification, as if it were an automatic pass that annulled any need for basic respect. As if sharing blood meant I had to tolerate anything, accept any invasion, forgive any lack of consideration. Precisely because you are family is why this hurts so much. Because I would expect you more than anyone to understand that I also deserve to be treated with dignity. David let out another laugh, this time longer, sharper, laden with disbelief. He turned around, walked a few steps toward the window, then returned, as if the movement helped him process what was happening. "This is crazy. You're being completely irrational. Are you going to kick us out onto the street? Your own son?" "Why? Because we arrived a few hours before we could talk to you? Because we didn't follow some ridiculous protocol you just invented?" "I didn't just invent anything, David. Asking before moving into someone's house isn't a ridiculous protocol. It's basic respect. It's what you would do with any other person in your life. It's what you would expect others to do with you." He shook his head, his hands on his hips, looking at me as if he were seeing a stranger. "I can't believe you're doing this, after everything we've done for you." That sentence fell between us like a stone in quiet water. Everything they had done for me. I waited for him to elaborate, to tell me specifically what that everything he was referring to was. But he didn't continue. He just stood there, breathing heavily, as if those words were argument enough by themselves. "Everything you've done for me. Tell me, David. Help me remember. What exactly have you done for me that justifies me having to give up my peace of mind?" David opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Chloe, seeking support, but she was looking down at the floor, biting her lower lip. He looked back at me, and now there was something different in his expression. It was no longer just disbelief or frustration. There was anger there, genuine and rising. "You want a list? Fine. We bought you that new television last year when yours broke down. I offered to pay you for it. You said it wasn't necessary, that it was a gift. And then you mentioned it at every family dinner for the next 6 months as an example of your generosity. We took you to the doctor when you sprained your ankle. Because I had no way to get there and you were passing by here on your way home. And you dropped me off at the hospital entrance. You didn't go in with me. I waited 3 hours alone until a nurse got me a taxi to go back. We invite you out to dinner every time we celebrate something. You invite me when you need someone else to pay part of the bill, or when you need to look good in front of other people. by showing you're good children who include their mother. But at those dinners, you talk amongst yourselves, check your phones, make plans that don't include me. I'm just there as family decoration. David took a step toward me, and there was something dangerous in his movement now. Not physically threatening, but laden with an emotion that was about to overflow. You know what your problem is, Mum? That nothing anyone does for you is enough. There's always something wrong. There's always a but. You always find a way to make yourself the victim. I'm not making myself the victim. I'm setting a boundary. There's a huge difference. No, what you're doing is punishing me because your life didn't turn out the way you wanted. Because Dad left. Because you had to work hard. Because you feel lonely. And now, when I finally have some stability, when I can finally ask you for a favor, you decide this is the perfect time to charge me emotional debts for things that happened decades ago. His words felt like physical blows, each one designed to hurt me, to make me doubt, to turn my legitimate boundary into an act of unjustified revenge. And the most painful part was that there was a fragment of truth in what he was saying. Yes, I felt lonely sometimes. Yes, I had carried resentments for years. Yes, there were moments when I looked at my life and wondered where all the time had gone, all the energy, all the version of myself that existed before I became a mother, an employee, the person everyone needed me to be. But that didn't change the fact that I had a right to my space, that I deserved to be consulted, that my life wasn't a territory available for invasion just because my son decided he needed it. You're right about one thing, David. My life didn't turn out the way I wanted. But you know what part didn't turn out the way I wanted? The part where I raised a son who sees me as a resource instead of a person. The part where I spent so many years being useful that I forgot how to be valued. The part where I convinced myself that love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. Chloe intervened, her voice shaky but trying to sound reasonable. Audrey, please. We understand you're upset. We understand we made a mistake by not consulting you first. But kicking David out, kicking out your own son, is a disproportionate reaction. It's cruel. Cruel. That word resonated in my head. It was cruel to protect my space. It was cruel to set boundaries. It was cruel to say no. But it wasn't cruel to arrive unannounced. It wasn't cruel to assume my life was at their disposal. It wasn't cruel to minimize my feelings or treat me as invisible. The cruelty apparently only went in one direction. You know what's truly cruel? Raising a son alone for decades, sacrificing every dream I had. Working until my hands bled and my back could no longer straighten. All to make sure he had opportunities I never had. And then, when I finally have a little peace, a little space to breathe, discovering that to him I'm just a convenience, a place to stay when it's cheaper than a hotel. David had raised his voice now, and his cheeks were red with contained emotion. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask for Dad to leave. I didn't ask for you to have to work so hard. Those were your decisions, your circumstances. You can't blame me for that now. I'm not blaming you for any of that, David. I'm blaming you for not seeing that I am a person too. For treating me as if my only function is to make your life easier. For arriving here today and acting as if my consent didn't matter. He walked closer to the suitcases, grabbed one of them with more force than necessary, and looked at me with a mixture of pain and rage that made it difficult to hold his gaze. You know what? You're right. We're leaving. I don't need this. I don't need to be in a place where I'm clearly not welcome. Where my own mother treats me like a stranger. I'm not treating you like a stranger. I'm treating you with the same standard you treat me, without prior consideration. David lifted the suitcase, stumbling slightly with its weight, and headed toward the door. Chloe followed him, taking the other suitcase. But before reaching the exit, she turned around to look at me one last time. "I hope this is worth it, Audrey. I hope your space and your peace are worth losing your son." "My son isn't lost because I set a boundary. If he leaves and doesn't come back, it's because he chose to value his comfort more than our relationship. It's because he preferred to be angry than to be wrong." David had already opened the door and was stepping out into the hallway when he suddenly stopped. He turned around, looked at me with a strange expression I couldn't immediately decipher. And then, to my complete surprise, he burst into laughter. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was a bitter, sarcastic laugh, filled with disbelief. "This is perfect, truly perfect. Wait until I tell everyone how my mother kicked me out of her house for daring to ask her for help. Wait until the family hears about this. Wait until Aunt Olivia knows that generous Audrey, the one who always has her doors open, has now become so selfish that she won't even help her own son." There it was, the veiled threat, the promise that if I maintained my decision, he would make sure everyone knew what kind of terrible mother I had become, that he would call my sister, my cousins, anyone who would listen, and tell them his version of events. A version where he was the innocent victim and I was the cruel mother who had abandoned him in his moment of need. For a second, I felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing against my chest. That automatic impulse to yield, to apologize, to say that it had all been a misunderstanding, and that, of course, they could stay. That instinct that had been cultivated over decades of being the person who kept the peace, who avoided conflict, who sacrificed her own comfort to avoid being seen as difficult. But then I remembered something my friend Shirley had told me 3 months before she died. We were sitting in her hospital room, and she had taken my hand with fingers that barely had strength left, and had looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too much of life. "Audrey," she had said, in a voice barely audible above the constant beeping of the machines, "the biggest mistake I made was worrying more about what people thought of me than what I thought of myself. I spent 70 years trying to be what others needed, and now that I'm dying, I can't remember a single moment when I lived for myself." Those words had been echoing in my head since her funeral. And now, standing across from my son and his implicit threat to destroy my family reputation, I understood that the moment had come to decide what mattered more: the image others had of me, or the truth of who I really was. "Go ahead, David. Call whoever you want. Tell them whatever you want. If your version of events is that you respectfully asked permission and I denied you help without reason, then so be it. But we both know that's not the truth. We both know you arrived here unannounced, assuming my house was your house, treating me as if my consent were irrelevant." David dropped the suitcase on the floor with a loud thump. His eyes were bright now, not with tears, but with pure rage. "You know what, Mum? You're right. I didn't ask permission. And you know why? Because I never thought I would have to ask my own mother for permission to stay in her house for a few days. Because I grew up believing that family helped each other unconditionally. Because you taught me throughout my entire childhood that the doors of this house would always be open to me. I taught you wrong then. I taught you that love meant unlimited access. That being family meant I didn't have the right to say no. I taught you that my space was your space and that my needs mattered less than yours. And now I'm correcting that mistake." Chloe intervened again, and now there were real tears running down her cheeks, though I wasn't sure if they were from sadness or frustration. "Please, Audrey. David, let's all calm down. It doesn't have to end like this. We can find a solution, we can." "There's nothing to solve, Chloe. You need a place to stay. I need my space. Those two things aren't compatible. It's not complicated. David picked up the suitcase again and walked toward the hallway, stopping right in the doorway threshold. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and his voice sounded different now, colder, more distant. When you change your mind, when you realize what you just did, don't expect me to come back as if nothing happened. Don't expect me to forget that you kicked me out when I needed you. I didn't kick you out when you needed me, David. I kicked you out when you decided that needing me meant you could ignore me. He walked out into the hallway without saying anything else. Chloe took the second suitcase, but before leaving, she turned around to look at me. Her face was red, streaked with tears, and there was something in her eyes that resembled genuine confusion. I don't understand you, Audrey. I really don't. What kind of mother does this? The kind of mother who finally learned that loving herself isn't an act of selfishness. It's survival. She shook her head, mumbled something I couldn't hear, and walked out into the hallway where David was already waiting for the elevator. I stood in the doorway of my apartment watching them. David's back was rigid, the posture of someone who felt deeply betrayed. Chloe was checking her phone, probably looking for nearby hotels. The elevator arrived with a soft, electronic chime. The doors opened. David entered first, dragging his suitcase with a brusque movement that made it hit the frame. Chloe followed him, and just before the doors closed, David looked at me one last time. He hadn't said anything, but the expression on his face said everything. Disappointment, rage, lack of understanding, and something deeper, something that looked like the genuine pain of someone who felt they had just lost something important. Part of me wanted to run to the elevator, stop the doors before they closed, tell them to come back, that I was sorry that they could stay. That part of me that had spent decades learning to prioritize the emotional comfort of others over my own. That part that had been trained to believe that conflict was the worst possible outcome, worse even than my own unhappiness. But I didn't move. I stood there, watching the elevator doors close, listening to the mechanical sound of its descent, knowing that with every floor it descended, I was also closing a chapter of my life. I went back into my apartment and closed the door. The silence that greeted me was different from other nights. It wasn't the comfortable silence of chosen solitude. It was the heavy silence of consequences, of difficult decisions, of bridges I had perhaps just burned. I walked toward the guest room where Chloe had begun to settle in. The clothes were still spread out on the bed. The toiletries were still lined up on the dresser. The laptop was plugged in next to the nightstand, its indicator light softly blinking in the room's dimness. I began to gather their things. I folded the clothes carefully, even though my hands were trembling slightly. I put the toiletries in a plastic bag. I unplugged the laptop and placed it on the bed along with the other belongings. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because I needed to reclaim this space. I needed it to stop being the place where someone else had decided to set up without my permission and return to being simply my guest room. Empty, yes, but empty by my choice. When I finished, I left everything organized on the bed. If David or Chloe returned for their things, they would find them ready, respected, cared for, because that was the kind of person I was. Someone who could set firm boundaries without needing to be cruel. Someone who could say no without destroying what belonged to the other. I went back to the living room and sat in my armchair by the window. Outside, the evening was beginning to darken. The lights in the neighboring apartments were turning on one by one, small, illuminated windows in the twilight. I wondered how many of those windows held stories similar to mine. How many women were sitting in their own living rooms, struggling with the weight of having set a boundary? How many were wondering if they had done the right thing? My phone vibrated in my sweater pocket. I took it out and saw a text from David. Just 3 words. Hope you're happy." I didn't reply, because I wasn't happy. There was nothing joyful about what had just happened. There was no victory in having closed the door on my own son. There was no satisfaction in knowing that it would probably be weeks, maybe months, before we spoke again. But there was something else. Something that wasn't happiness, but that felt important nonetheless. There was clarity. There was the certainty that for the first time in decades, I had chosen my own dignity over the comfort of others. There was the feeling that I had recovered something I didn't even know I had lost, the right to say no without having to justify myself endlessly. Another message arrived. This one was from Chloe. "David is very upset. I don't think he'll call you for a long time. I hope your pride is worth it." My pride. As if setting boundaries was a matter of pride. As if protecting my space was an act of vanity instead of self-care. As if the problem was my resistance and not their invasion. I turned off the phone. Not because I was running away from the consequences of my actions, but because I needed silence. I needed to process what had just happened, without the constant interference of messages designed to make me feel guilty. I got up and went to the kitchen. The grocery bags were still on the table, exactly where I had left them what felt like hours ago, but had probably been only 45 minutes. I began to put away the groceries, moving on autopilot. The vegetables went into the refrigerator, the cans into the pantry. The bread was left in its usual basket on the counter. Every object found its designated place, and there was something comforting in that simple routine. Amidst the emotional chaos I had just gone through, these small actions anchored me to something tangible and predictable. When I finished putting everything away, I made myself a cup of tea. I heated the water. I chose my favorite mug, that light blue ceramic one I had bought at a local market years ago, and watched as the leaves slowly expanded in the hot water. The familiar aroma enveloped me, and for the first time since I had opened the door to my apartment that afternoon, I felt like I could breathe completely. I sat down again in my armchair with the mug between my hands. The heat of the tea transferred through the ceramic and warmed my palms. Outside, night had completely fallen. The city continued its constant rhythm, indifferent to the little drama that had just unfolded in my sixth-floor apartment. And then, without warning, I started to cry. They weren't dramatic sobs. It wasn't the heartbroken weeping of someone who had just lost something irreplaceable. They were silent tears that simply ran down my cheeks while I remained seated, holding my tea, looking out into the darkness on the other side of the window. Tears that had been waiting decades for their turn to come out. I cried for the mother I had been, that young woman who worked 2 shifts and came home so tired she could barely stay awake to help David with his homework. I cried for the years I had spent convincing myself that constant sacrifice was love, when in reality it was just fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if I didn't give myself completely, my son wouldn't love me. Fear of ending up alone. And now here I was, alone anyway. But it was a different kind of solitude. It wasn't the result of abandonment or rejection. It was the consequence of having chosen my own dignity. And although it hurt, although it felt as if I had lost something important, there was also a strange sense of relief. Like when you finally drop something heavy that you've been carrying for so long that you no longer even remembered how it felt not to carry it. I remembered a specific moment from when David was 8 years old. It had been a particularly difficult day at my job at the coffee shop. A customer had yelled because his order had taken too long, my boss had scolded me for something that wasn't my fault, and I had come home with my feet so swollen I could barely walk. David was in the living room watching television when I came in. "Mom," he had said without looking away from the screen. "I'm hungry." I had dropped my bags by the door, taken off my shoes that were squeezing my sore feet, and gone straight to the kitchen to prepare him something to eat. I hadn't even sat down first. I hadn't even taken a moment for myself. Because that's what good mothers did. Good mothers put their children's needs before everything else. But what was I really teaching him with that behavior? I was teaching him that women existed to serve, that mothers didn't have boundaries, that saying, "Give me a moment" or "I'm tired" was selfishness instead of basic self-care. And now, 34 years later, my son had grown up believing exactly that. It wasn't entirely his fault. I had been his most consistent teacher in that mistaken lesson. Every time I had ignored my own needs for his. Every time I had smiled despite being exhausted. Every time I had pretended everything was fine when I was actually falling apart inside. I had taught him that I didn't matter as much as he did, and he had learned the lesson perfectly. I took a sip of my tea. It was already cooling, but the familiar taste comforted me anyway. I thought about Shirley again, about those last conversations we had in the hospital. She had been so brave at the end, facing death with a brutal clarity that only came when there was no longer time for comforting lies. "You know what's the saddest thing, Audrey?" she had told me one afternoon while I peeled an orange to share with her. "It's not that I'm dying. We all die eventually. The sad thing is that I spent my whole life waiting for the moment when I could finally live for myself. When the kids grew up, when I retired, when I had more money. When? And now that moment is never going to come because I ran out of time." She had squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. If you need to say no, say it. If you need space, take it. If you need to choose yourself, do it, because no one else is going to do it for you." I finished my tea and left the empty mug on the side table. I sat in the silence of my apartment, listening to the distant sounds of the city. A car passed on the street below. Someone laughed in one of the neighboring apartments. Life continued, indifferent to my little personal revolution. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a text from my sister, Olivia. David had already called her. Of course. The news of what I had done was already circulating through the family. "Audrey, what happened? David called me very upset, saying you kicked him out of your house. He says they only needed to stay for a few days. Is it true? Call me when you can." I could perfectly imagine that conversation. David presenting himself as the misunderstood victim. Olivia, always so diplomatic, trying to understand both sides, but probably leaning towards sympathy for David, because after all, he was the family's son. And I would be painted as the difficult mother who had suddenly become selfish in her old age. I should have felt anger at the prospect of being misunderstood. I should have wanted to call Olivia immediately to give my version of events, to defend myself, to make sure everyone understood that I wasn't the villain in this story. But I realized something important. It didn't matter as much as I thought it would. Because the truth was, Olivia, despite being my sister and loving me in her own way, had never truly understood why I had allowed her to stay in my apartment for an entire year after her divorce. She had never recognized the sacrifice that had represented for me. She had assumed, like everyone else, that I had plenty of space and plenty of time and plenty of energy left over, because that was what women like me had, scraps of ourselves to distribute to whoever needed them. I wasn't going to call her, at least not that night. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after tomorrow. Or maybe never. Maybe it was time to let people think whatever they wanted to think. Maybe it was time to stop spending my energy trying to control the narratives others built about me. I got up from the armchair and walked toward my bedroom. As I passed the guest room, I took a quick glance. Chloe's things were still there, neatly arranged on the bed. I would have to call David tomorrow to tell him he could come pick them up whenever he wanted. But that was a problem for tomorrow, not for tonight. In my room, I changed slowly. I put on my most comfortable pajamas, that soft cotton one that was a little worn but felt like a hug. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, followed every step of my nightly routine with deliberate slowness. Every action was a silent affirmation. This is my space. This is my time. This is my life. I got into bed and turned off the light. The darkness enveloped me, and with it came a thought I hadn't expected. Relief. Pure and simple relief. I wouldn't have to wake up early tomorrow because of the noise of other people moving around my apartment. I wouldn't have to share the bathroom or wait my turn to make coffee. I wouldn't have to modulate my behavior or consider the needs of others before deciding what I wanted to do with my day. But along with the relief also came the weight of the pain. Because my son was angry with me. Because there was a rupture in our relationship that I didn't know when or how it would be repaired. Because I had chosen my peace over his comfort, and that choice had consequences I would have to face. I allowed myself to feel both things at the same time, the relief and the pain, the certainty of having done the right thing, and the sadness of the consequences, the strength of having set boundaries, and the vulnerability of not knowing what came next. I closed my eyes and let sleep gradually arrive. Before falling completely asleep, I had a final thought. Maybe this was what it truly meant to grow up. Not when you formally became an adult, not when you had a job or a house or even a child, but when you finally learned that loving yourself wasn't selfishness, it was responsibility, it was justice, it was the only way to live with integrity. And with that thought, I finally let myself drift off to rest. I woke up the next day with the sunlight gently streaming through my bedroom window. For a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and waking, everything seemed normal. But then the memory of what had happened the night before returned with the force of a cold wave, and I lay there looking at the ceiling, slowly processing the fact that I had kicked my son out of my house. I got out of bed and followed my morning routine as I always did. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, brushed my teeth. Every familiar action helped anchor me to the present, to remember that life continued despite the emotional drama of yesterday. But when I left my room and walked toward the kitchen, I couldn't help but look toward the guest room. The door was still ajar. Chloe's things were still on the bed, waiting to be claimed. I made coffee. The rich aroma filled the kitchen as I took out my favorite mug and waited for the coffee maker to finish its work. I poured myself a cup, added a little cream as always, and sat down by the living room window. Outside, Friday morning was in full swing. People were walking to their jobs, kids were on their way to school. The world kept spinning, completely oblivious to the small, personal earthquake I had experienced. My phone was on the table where I had left it the night before. I turned it on with some apprehension, knowing there would probably be more messages. And there were. 3 more from Olivia, each one more insistent than the last. One from my cousin Tanya, asking if I was okay. And one from David that simply said, "I'm coming by this afternoon to pick up our things. You don't need to be here if you don't want to." I read that last message several times, trying to decipher the tone behind the words. Was it consideration? Was it coldness? Was it his way of giving me an out, of allowing me to avoid an awkward confrontation? I wasn't sure. But what I did know was that I wasn't going to hide in my own house. If David was coming to pick up his things, I would be here. I replied with a simple, "I'll be here. Ring the doorbell when you arrive." I spent the morning cleaning. Not because the apartment was dirty, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. I vacuumed the entire living room. I wiped the kitchen counters until they shone. I changed the sheets on my bed, even though I had changed them just 3 days earlier. It was physical therapy, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside me. Around noon, I finally decided to call Olivia, not because I felt I owed her an explanation, but because she was my sister, and despite everything, I cared what she thought. I dialed her number and waited as it rang. "Audrey, thank goodness. I've been worried all night." Olivia's voice sounded genuinely distressed, and something in me softened a little. "Hello, Olivia. Sorry I didn't answer sooner. It was a difficult night. David told me what happened. Well, he told me his version. I want to hear yours." At least she hadn't automatically assumed David was right and I was wrong. I thanked her mentally for that before beginning to explain the situation. I told her about the suitcases at the entrance, about how they hadn't consulted me, about the conversation we had, and how it had escalated until I finally asked them to leave. Olivia listened in silence, interrupting only occasionally with clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "I understand why you felt that way, Audrey. I really do. But don't you think you maybe overreacted a little? It's David. It's your son. Surely you could have found a way to resolve this without kicking him out." There it was, the response I had been waiting for. That subtle suggestion that I had exaggerated, that I had taken things too far. And maybe she was right. Maybe there were other ways to handle the situation. But I also knew that if I had given in, if I had allowed them to stay after they arrived unannounced, I would be teaching David once again that my boundaries didn't matter. I didn't overreact, Olivia. I reacted appropriately. David is 42 years old. He is an adult man with a stable job and enough resources to pay for a hotel. He decided it was more convenient to use my space without consulting me. That's not okay, no matter how much I love him. But that's just how families are, isn't it? We help each other when there's a need. We don't ask permission every time we need something. I should have known Olivia would say something like that. She had lived with me for a year, after all. And during that time, I had never charged her rent. I had never asked her to contribute significantly to expenses. I had never put a time limit on her finding her own place. I had been the generous, available, understanding sister. And now that I was setting boundaries, I must seem like a hypocrite. "Do you remember when you lived with me after your divorce, Olivia?" There was a silence on the other end of the line. "Of course I remember. You were very generous to let me stay. Do you know why I didn't ask you to leave after a few weeks or even a few months?" Olivia didn't answer immediately, and I continued before she could. "Because I was scared. I was scared that if I set boundaries, if I asked you to find your own place, you would think I was selfish, that I didn't love you enough, that I was a bad sister. So I swallowed my discomfort and my need for personal space, and I let you stay because that was what good sisters did." "Audrey, I didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything." "Exactly. I never said anything, and that was my mistake. Because by not saying anything, I taught everyone around me that I had no boundaries, that they could take what they needed from me without worrying about the cost to me. And now, after decades of doing that, I am finally learning to use my voice. And it hurts. It hurts to set boundaries. It hurts to disappoint people. But it hurts less than continuing to disappear in my own life." Olivia sighed deeply. "I don't know what to tell you, Audrey. I understand what you're saying. I really do. But David is very hurt. He's saying he's not going to talk to you for a long time. That's his choice. I'm not punishing him. I'm just protecting my space. If he decides that's reason enough to cut contact with me, then that says more about him than about me." We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. The conversation hadn't ended badly, but it also hadn't left me feeling completely understood. Olivia was a product of the same generation as me, raised with the same expectations about what it meant to be a good woman, a good mother, a good sister. It was difficult for her to understand why I was rejecting those rules now, after having followed them so faithfully for so long. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I got up from the sofa where I had been reading, took a deep breath, and went to open the door. On the other side was David, alone. There was no sign of Chloe. He was carrying 2 large canvas bags, probably to put the things they had left. "Hi, Mum." His voice was flat, without emotion. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone fulfilling an uncomfortable obligation. "Hi, David. Come in." He moved past me without making eye contact and headed directly to the guest room. I closed the door and stayed in the living room, unsure whether I should follow him or give him space. I finally decided to stay where I was, but I left the guest room door in view. I could hear him moving around the room, opening and closing drawers, the sound of the bags zipping up. It took him about 10 minutes to pack everything. When he came out, he had both bags hanging from his shoulders, and his expression was still that carefully neutral mask. He stopped in the living room, halfway between the room and the exit door. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something important, that maybe this was the opportunity for a real conversation. But instead, he simply nodded toward the hallway. "Can I use the bathroom quickly before I go?" "Sure." He dropped the bags next to the door and went to the bathroom. I heard the water running, the familiar sound of someone moving around a space they knew well. And in that moment, the reality of what I had done hit me. Not the part about setting boundaries or protecting my space. That still felt right. But the part about how my son, my only son, now felt like a stranger in the house where he had grown up. How he had to ask my permission to use the bathroom. How the distance between us had grown so quickly in just 24 hours. He came out of the bathroom and picked up the bags again. He headed toward the door, and I followed him. He opened the door, stopped on the threshold, and finally he looked directly at me. "Is there anything you want to say, Mum?" There were so many things I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him that I loved him. I wanted to explain to him one more time why I had had to do what I did. I wanted to ask him if we could ever have a relationship again, where I was seen as something more than a convenient resource. But what came out of my mouth was something different. "I love you, David. I will always love you. But I am no longer going to sacrifice my well-being to avoid your discomfort. If that means we go a while without speaking, then so be it. But the door will always be open for a relationship where we both respect each other mutually." He nodded slowly, as if processing my words. He didn't say he loved me too. He didn't say he understood. He just nodded. "Goodbye, Mum." "Goodbye, David." The door closed behind him with a soft sound that resonated much louder than it should have. I stood in that same spot for several minutes, looking at the closed door, listening to the absolute silence that filled my apartment. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no voices, just silence. I walked back to the living room and sat in my armchair by the window. My hands were trembling slightly, so I clasped them in my lap and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I had done it. I had maintained my boundary, even when my son had come to pick up his things with that hurt expression on his face. Even when every fibre of my motherly being wanted to run after him, apologize, beg him to come back. The following days passed with a strange slowness. I woke up every morning and followed my routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast. But everything felt different now. There was a weight in the air, a constant awareness that I had broken something, although I wasn't sure if what I had broken was my relationship with David or simply the dysfunctional pattern we had maintained for decades. Olivia called me twice more that first week. On the second call, her tone had changed. It was no longer just worry. There was something else there. Audrey, I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about when I lived with you after my divorce. I heard the sound of her taking a breath on the other end of the line, as if gathering courage. I never properly thanked you for that year. I never acknowledged what you sacrificed to give me space. I just assumed you were fine with it because you never said otherwise. But I should have asked. I should have been more considerate. I hadn't expected that apology. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't even known was tight. Thank you for saying that, Olivia. It means a lot. Maybe you were right about what you told David. Maybe we all assumed you would always be available, that you would always say yes, that you would never have your own needs. 2 weeks passed before I received the next message from David. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a conversation. Just a photo. It was an image of him and Chloe in front of what looked like their newly renovated apartment. The message said, "Renovations are finished. We're back home now." It didn't mention anything about what had happened. It didn't ask how I was. It was a cold, factual message, the kind of update you would send to a distant acquaintance rather than your mother. But it was something. It was a thin thread of communication, and I decided to take it for what it was, a small first step. I replied, "I'm glad you're comfortable in your space now. Take care." There was no reply after that. The days turned into weeks. I continued with my life. I went to the market on Thursdays, as always. I met my friends for coffee on Tuesdays. I read books I had been putting off for months. I spent whole afternoons sitting on my balcony, simply watching the city, something I had never allowed myself to do, when I had always been waiting for someone to need me. And slowly, very slowly, I began to notice something. The guilt I had been carrying, that constant feeling that I had done something terrible, began to diminish. In its place appeared something different. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like peace, like the feeling of having finally put down something heavy after carrying it for so long that your arms had forgotten how it felt to be free. 1 month after the incident, I was at the market choosing tomatoes when my phone rang. It was David. A real call, not just a text. My heart sped up as I looked at his name on the screen. I put the tomatoes back in their place and moved away from the crowd before answering. "Hello?" "Hello, Mum." His voice sounded different. It had lost that defensive tone it had the last time we spoke. "How are you?" "I'm fine. And you?" There was a long pause. I could hear background noise, maybe traffic, as if he were walking down the street. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you said." I didn't say anything, waiting, giving him space to continue. "You were right, Mum. Not about everything. I still think you could have handled it differently, but you were right about the main thing. I arrived without asking. I assumed you would be available because you always have been, and that wasn't okay." I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been tight for weeks. "Thank you for saying that, David. Chloe and I have been talking. She says she's always felt like I take you for granted, that I treat your generosity as if it were an obligation instead of a gift. And I think she's right." I listened to the words come out of my son's mouth and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would go back to how it was, because I didn't want it to be how it was before. But the hope that maybe, finally, we could build something new, something more honest. I appreciate you telling me this. I know it wasn't easy. Mum, I'd like for us to get lunch together. Just you and me. No Chloe. No pressure. Just to talk. Would you like that? I surprised myself by smiling. I would love that. We agreed to meet the following Saturday at a small restaurant halfway between our apartments. When I hung up, I realized that tears were running down my cheeks, but these were different from the ones I had cried that first night. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the possibility of healing. Saturday arrived, and I found myself nervous in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple brown dress that made me feel comfortable and dignified at the same time. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early and waited at a table by the window. David arrived exactly on time. He looked different too. There was something in his posture, in the way he approached the table, that was more humble than before. He sat across from me, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. "Hi, Mum." "Hi, son." We ordered food, and at first the conversation was awkward, full of uncomfortable pauses. But gradually, as we ate, the words began to flow more easily. David talked to me about his job, about the problems they were having with one of their projects. I asked him about Chloe and how she was handling the stress of her own job. And then, between the main course and dessert, David put down his fork and looked directly at me. "Mum, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen completely before you reply." I nodded, feeling my stomach clench with anticipation. My whole life I have seen you as my mother first, and as a person second. I never stopped to think about who you were beyond what you did for me. And that was selfish. It was unfair. And I'm sorry. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and I saw that his eyes were damp. "When you kicked me out of your house, I was furious. I thought you were being cruel, that you were punishing me for something I didn't understand. But after weeks of thinking about it, of talking with Chloe, even of talking with a therapist I started seeing, I realized something. I realized that I have never asked you what you need. I have never considered that your life doesn't exist only in relation to mine, and that has to change." Tears were running freely down my face now, and I didn't try to stop them. "I don't need you to be the perfect mother who always says yes to everything. I need to get to know the real person. Audrey, not just Mum. And if that means you sometimes tell me no, that you sometimes set boundaries, then I accept it. Because I'd rather have an honest relationship with you than keep living in this pattern where I take and you give until there's nothing left of you." I reached my hand across the table and took his. It was warm and a little shaky. "Thank you, David. You don't know how much it means to hear that." We spent the next 2 hours talking for real, not the superficial conversation we had maintained for years, but a real conversation about who we were, what we needed, how we could have a relationship that worked for both of us. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, difficult admissions, truths that hurt to speak. But it was real, and that was infinitely more valuable than the false harmony we had maintained before. When we finally said goodbye at the restaurant door, David hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory hug of family gatherings, but a real, long hug. The kind of hug that says, "I see you, I value you, I love you for who you are, not just for what you do for me." The following months weren't perfect. There were relapses, moments when David fell back into old patterns of taking my availability for granted. But the difference was that now I had a voice, and he was learning to listen. I learned that teaching children respect doesn't end when they grow up. Sometimes, the most important lesson comes when you finally say no. When you finally set the boundary you should have set years ago. When you finally choose yourself without apology. Because being a mother doesn't mean being invisible. It doesn't mean sacrificing every part of yourself on the altar of maternal love. It doesn't mean your house, your time, your life are resources available to whoever needs them without your consent. Being a mother means loving deeply, but it also means teaching your children that real love includes respect, that healthy relationships have boundaries, that you are also a person with needs, dreams, and the fundamental right to decide about your own life. That Thursday afternoon when I found the suitcases at my entrance wasn't the end of my relationship with my son. It was the beginning of a new relationship, one built on honesty instead of obligation, on mutual respect instead of unilateral sacrifice, on true love instead of dysfunctional patterns inherited from generations that taught us women existed to serve. And when I sit now in my armchair by the window, with my cup of hot coffee in my hands, looking at my quiet, tidy apartment, I feel something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride. Pride in having chosen myself. Pride in having found my voice. Pride in having taught my son that love doesn't mean the absence of boundaries, but the presence of respect. My house is still my house. My life is still my life. And I, Audrey Hayes, at my 68 years old, finally own both.